Carolina, one of the first conventions of its kind in the South, if not the first. James W. Hood is elected president of this convention, and here's what he has to say.
Gentlemen of the convention, I hardly know how to express my thanks for the high honor you have conferred upon me, an honor I could scarcely have dreamed of enjoying. There has never been before, and there will probably never be again, so important an assemblage of the colored people of North Carolina as the present in influence upon the destinies of the people for all time to come.
That's a fairly remarkable thing to say, isn't it? To have that kind of presence of mind of the history that is being made. And that's something that we can take away from this of how do we know that we are in one of those moments, one that I would say that we are in now. And indeed, what's important about this is that it's more than a historical event. What we look for in our history are signs of the building of structures and systems. And this Freedmen's Convention leads to another Freedmen's Convention held the next year. That convention leads to the development of the Constitution of the Educational Association of the Colored People of North Carolina. And here's what this convention, Constitutional Association, was about. The object of this association shall be to aid in the establishment of schools from which none shall be excluded on account of color or poverty, and to encourage unsectarian education in the state, especially among the freedmen. And so, as we think about leading to that 1868 convention, when James Walker Hood makes that comment about not separating the races, this is what's going on in North Carolina. And indeed, this state organization has a grassroots function, has chapters throughout North Carolina, and we can, without question, see that it is a major move for public education after the Civil War. So I want to come back to the 1868 Constitutional Convention and pick up another quote. This one is from Samuel Stanford Ashley, a delegate also to the convention, and he came to us originally from New Hampshire and Massachusetts. He also is a minister, and he is also a principal and educator. He is chair of the education section of the Constitutional Committee, but it is when the Declaration of Rights, the first section of our Constitution, is being proposed that he makes this suggestion of an amendment to the Declaration of Rights.
The people have a right to the privileges of education, and it is the duty of the state to guard and maintain that right.
So that comment, that proposed amendment that he makes on the floor, which comes from nowhere else. North Carolina is the only state in the country with an education provision in its Declaration of Rights, right there with freedom of speech, freedom to vote, comes from Reverend Samuel Stanford Ashley. So how did he end up at this convention? So a little bit about his background. He comes to North Carolina as a part of the American Missionary Association. He is a part of the Northern philanthropic effort to help the South, and specifically those people who had been enslaved. In particular, at this time in the Civil War, this is in March of 1865, General Sherman is sending 10,000 war refugees, most of them freed blacks, to Wilmington. They arrive by boat and they walk, and in this walk, over 3,000 of them die, leaving many orphan children. And it is the American Missionary Association, a philanthropic organization, the Freedmen's Bureau that is funded by Congress, that prepare for the arrival of these refugees. Reverend Samuel Stanford Ashley is one of those who is sent. His responsibility is solely education. So at this time of amazing human calamity, education is front of mind. And Ashley reports, before I rise in the morning, black people are at the door waiting for me, and they are there until dark. Then for 2 evenings in the week, I meet a class of men who are preparing themselves to preach. Reverend Ashley establishes 6 schools in the Wilmington area, the first orphanage in North Carolina. One of those schools is the Williston School, which has deep roots in its community now, and you can learn more about it at the Cape Fear Museum. These schools for freed blacks are so important that we can see their presence throughout the Eastern North Carolina especially. And at one of these schools, these are the monthly reports for the schools, and the author of this report says there is a great need of teacher here for the poor whites. At the commencement of this month, several of these people sought admission to the colored schools. He pleaded so earnestly for these crumbs of knowledge that they should gather them at the freedman's table that I had no heart to deny them. So why don't poor whites have schools for whites to go to? Well, the General Assembly, after the Civil War is over, abolishes the position of the state superintendent, which was a legislatively held position, and the treasurer of the literary fund. Those are the only 2 statewide positions. They clean out the literary funds, which were the funds available for public education at the state level, saying that they can be used for any other purpose. So of course they are applied to war debt and other needs. And they remove the local requirements for providing education. A year later, the General Assembly comes back, and this time they allow for local education. But as you read at the bottom of the screen, you'll see it is education for all the white children. So we are almost 2 years past the Civil War, but North Carolina is only looking to provide education for white children. So that's why this Constitutional Convention of 1868 is so important, where because of the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867, we have a very different group of delegates in attendance. It is this multiracial democracy that is in action. James Walker Hood makes this statement as a part of his arguments that he makes many, many times against putting race in the Constitution, and he is successful in his arguments. North Carolina is one of very few southern states not to provide for separation of the races in its Constitution. Ashley also is successful. That amendment that he offers to the Declaration of Rights becomes a part of the Constitution, and it is still a part of our Constitution, word for word. One of the other ways that we benefit from this multiracial democracy and these delegates who came to us with a fervor for transformation is that they came from states where the Midwest constitutions had fairly recent provisions for education, and it represented some of our best thinking about education. All of these southern states had to adopt new constitutions as a part of being readmitted into the Union. And so by means of these delegates that were part of the constitutional conventions in our states, these different constitutional provisions in the Midwest constitutions were brought to us. And so our language in North Carolina for a general and uniform system of free schools, that comes directly out of these Midwest constitutions, and is again, North Carolina is considered to have the best language possible on that general and uniform system language. And in Leandro versus State, in the first opinion to come out of this important decision, series of decisions, the Supreme Court says, at the time this provision was originally written in 1868, the intent of the framers was that every child have a fundamental right to a sound basic education, which would prepare the child to participate fully in society as it existed in his or her lifetime. And so when we see this language of the framers, we can think this is the multiracial democracy. This is that justice coalition that came together in 1868. And indeed, our Supreme Court goes on further to say that these two provisions, Article 1, Section 15, which is the Declaration of Rights, and Article 9, Section 2, the General and Uniform System, combine to guarantee every child of this state an opportunity to receive a sound basic education in our public schools. So when Chairman Davis mentioned the constitutional mandate for sound basic education, this is where it comes from. It comes from Hood, it comes from Ashley and this coalition. And in fact, looking at the South, W.B. Du Bois says, it is fair to say that the Negro carpetbag governments established the public schools of the South. And I believe all of our history and our looking at the evidence proves this to be true. We would simply change the language from Negro carpetbag to this multiracial democracy. Now, if this is not something that you have known for a long time, that you are well grounded in, there's a good reason for that. North Carolina has intentionally told a different story. The Pearson Plan, which I will be talking about in a few minutes, gives this version of the story. In this plan that's a part of the General Assembly report, it says, the white race has been almost wholly responsible for the creation, development, and support of an educational system which has been and is now educating the Negro children of the state, all of them. That's a very different point of view, and factually, it's wrong. So that closes what I wanted to share with you about that first critical time in education, and I'd be happy to pause now to see if there's any questions or observations that you want to share with each other.
Board members, do we have any questions we'd like to ask of Ms. McCall regarding the first portion of her presentation?
Mr. Ford, this is Olivia. I do have a quick question.
Ms. Oxendine, Dr. Oxendine, please proceed.
It's nice hearing your voice, and it's been a long time.
Good to hear you.
I am a little bit confused about a point that you made a few minutes ago about the poor white children. Talk just briefly about why well, maybe I'm misunderstanding this, were they denied an opportunity to be to the schools, or explain that rather odd phenomenon?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Oxendine. So after the Civil War, the provision of public education is really put in jeopardy when the General Assembly takes away funding, takes away the local requirements, provides that communities could provide it for the white children, not for all children. And so what happens after the Civil War is white children with means are going to private academies. Black children are having access, at least some of them, to these schools that are created by the AMA and the Freedmen's Bureau. And so it's poor white children who are really left out without an education, with nothing provided by the state, without the means to get their own private education. And so indeed, there were examples like the one I shared with you, where they would go to the schools that were for freed blacks in order to obtain an education. And the reason for this is, does connect right back to race. So we were closing our schools. We were willing to close our schools after the Civil War to avoid providing schools for blacks and the possibility of blacks and whites being in schools together.
Okay, so there was really an element of affluence in play there. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Mr. Ford.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Hall, please proceed.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, Dr. McCall. This is Wendell Holt. It's good to see you after all these years.
Yes.
I have a question about the children of free people of color. Are they treated the same? Do they have their own schools? Because I'm told that some had their own schools prior to the state taking in that responsibility. Can you talk a little about the free people of color children and the schooling?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Mr. Hall. So once the Freedmen's Bureau and the American Missionary Association come in to provide education and they start setting up these schools, they are both for people who had always been free and were black, as well as people who were black and had been enslaved. And I should note that they were for people regardless of age. So when Reverend Ashley adds that constitutional amendment of the people shall have a right to the privilege of education, it's intentional about the people because it means young or adult. It means black or white, freed or previously enslaved. So once we have Northern philanthropy and Congress providing funds through the Freedmen's Bureau, there is equal access. During the Civil War, prior to the Civil War, we of course had the laws that prevented the education of enslaved people. People who were free may have had access to some education, but those who were enslaved as a part of that economic model of holding people down, they were not allowed to have education.
Okay. Thank you.
Certainly.
Any other questions for Ann before she proceeds with the rest of her presentation? Hearing none, Ann, you can feel free to proceed.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ford. So the next critical time that we can focus on is 1901. And if I'm to provide a short catchphrase for these different times, I would refer to this as the time that white supremacy seeks inequity. Each of those words is intentional. White supremacy is the label that was used at the time to talk about those who wanted to see whites in control. The seek inequity is meant to reflect a very intentional act. So I want to hold on to that because you're right now trying to intentionally seek equity. And it's useful to see what happens, the power of intention this time for inequity. So once again, there is a ramp up to 1901 that I want to share. James Walker Hood's efforts in the 1868 Constitutional Convention to keep race out was lost in 1875 when white supremacists are back in power and they make 30 amendments to the Constitution, and one of them is to provide for separate races, separation of the students by race. Now you will notice it says no discrimination shall be made in favor of or to the prejudice of either race. That's language that rarely has seemed to mean anything, including in Plessy versus Ferguson. Now up to 1898, this is a case that you're all familiar with that says that separate but equal satisfies the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. I've included a phrase on here, though, that I think is important to see how the court was starting to try and parse out what we mean by equal. So the majority of the Supreme Court said the object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. So you can see what they're trying to do is just say that equality is only political equality, and it's a very narrow set of laws, although quite important. And one of those most important laws is voting. And this is a graph of voting pattern from 1880 to 1896. Of course, it is only males that are voting at this time. But we can notice some pretty important things here. For white males, the voting is pretty consistent. It hovers between 81% up to 87%, only dips down to 78%. For black males, it's a different story. In 1884, it goes all the way to 98%. Imagine that. We can't think of any time in current history where we have had anything remotely close to 98% of a population choosing to vote. That dips down to 68%, 64%, and 88 and 92 respectively. Why? I bet you can imagine why. It's the voter intimidation, it's the KKK, it's terrorist activities that prevent black males from getting to the polls. Some of that is addressed. So in 1896, black males are voting 87%. So for those who want to see whites in control, and for those who would say this is a problem of Negro domination, Negroes are voting at a higher percent than whites, they're starting to look for ways to address it. So one of them is in our mapping of congressional districts. This is what it looked like in that first time period that we talked about, that period right around 1868. And you'll notice that the state looks like little puzzle pieces. Like you could cut this out and first graders could put this together easily. We changed that. And then in the next period, 1872 to 1883, which is in that time period when white supremacists are coming back into control, what happens to the second congressional district? Happens again, and this is what it looks like leading into the 1901 period. So what is this, what we would now call gerrymandering about? What are they trying to capture by these reconfigurations of the congressional district maps? Well, each of the counties that are included in the second congressional district have a high percentage of blacks that are there that can vote, somewhere between 40 to 60% easily. The idea is to put these districts with a high percentage of blacks all together so that they have less impact in other districts. And if you are a white politician in the second district, you're going to have a hard time because now you're up against a number of blacks who may want to run for office and blacks who are choosing to vote for someone other than you. And that would be true for James B. Aycock, someone who was coming in as a politician. He had been, we sometimes forget this, he had been an educator and a superintendent. And he wants to be able to be in office, he wants to be governor, and he wants to change the equation. He is not alone, and there is, in North Carolina's history, one of our darkest moments is the Wilmington coup d'etat. Coup d'etat is a specific reference to an overthrow of a government, and this is the only one on American soil to ever occur. November 10 is 2 days after elections were held, where on November 8, a multiracial democracy was elected. The Red Shirts, which was a paramilitary white supremacy organization, descended into Wilmington with their ranks swelling to about 2,000 vigilantes. The building that you see burned here was the newspaper for blacks. They also burned and destroyed other property owned by blacks. They murdered between 60 and 300 blacks. They forcefully removed the white and black politicians out of office and replaced them with white supremacists. It is against this backdrop that Charles Aycock offers his nomination speech for governor in 1900. And in this, you will hear reference to the Wilmington coup d'etat. You will also hear reference to his plan that intermingles disenfranchisement of blacks within a campaign for education. And here's that speech.
We have taught them much in the past 2 years in the University of White Supremacy. We will graduate them in August next with a diploma that will entitle them to form a genuine white man's party. Then we shall have no more revolutions in Wilmington. We shall have no more dead and wounded Negroes on the streets, because we shall have good government in the state and peace everywhere. But to do this, we must disfranchise the Negro. The amendment to the Constitution is presented in solution of the problem. The Democratic Party knows the truth. It is certain that the unlettered white man is more capable of government than the Negro. But the opponents of the amendment attack it on another ground. They say that every child who comes of age after 1908, white and black, must be able to read and write before he can vote. This is true. The schools are open and will be for 4 or more months every year from now to 1908. The white child under 13 who will not learn to read and write in the next 8 years will be without excuse. I tell you that the prosperity and the glory of our grand old state are to be more advanced by this clause than by any other one thing. Speak the truth. Tell it in Gath. Tell it in the streets of Ascalon. That universal education of the white children of North Carolina will send us forward and abound in the race with the world. With the adoption of this amendment after 1908, there will be no state in the Union with a larger percentage of boys and girls who can read and write, and no state will rush forward with more celerity or certainty than conservative old North Carolina.
So he is successful in his election to governor, and the constitutional amendment for a literacy test is voted in. And our Constitution then includes this literacy test that requires every person presenting himself for registration to be able to read and write any section of the Constitution in the English language. When ACOG was referring to everyone having to read by 1908, it's because of this grandfather clause, that if your descendant could vote, in other words, you were white, you had until 1908 to learn how to read and write yourself. This was a successful tactic for black males. More than half of them were illiterate. This will be a successful tactic in preventing them from voting. And for white males with almost 1/5 illiterate, it provides an incentive to get them to education. In terms of voting, it has the desired effect, and we go from 67% of black males voting in 1900 to 0% in 1904. And this campaign for education is run out of the state capitol, and here is some of the results of this campaign.
Next Monday will be an important day in Anson, the County Board of Education having decreed that all the public schools of the county shall open their doors that day. It is a painful truth that many of our people have not, in the past, taken that lively interest in public education which its important demands. The white parents of the county should be informed that their children, who come of age after 1908, cannot vote unless they can read and write. Surely there is no white parent in Anson County who wishes to see his little boy grow to manhood and not have the privilege of casting a ballot for the party of his choice. The schools are provided for them, and there should be such a strong public sentiment developed that it will be practically impossible for any man to allow his children to grow up in utter ignorance.
And who's going to run this campaign? Well, that's going to be James Joyner, who becomes state superintendent, elected in 1902, and remains in that position until 1990. And this truly was an extraordinary campaign called the Campaign Committee for the Promotion of Public Education. There were broad efforts to have speakers across the state. We can go into their files and see all of the organization efforts. And indeed, there's significant news coverage of all of these speaking engagements and this push for education. Joyner also does the work with the county superintendents. Those meetings that are held between the state superintendent and the county superintendents became the norm back in this time. And I'll just show you one of the agendas from this time period. And as you are having your own retreat, you probably would recognize some kinds of issues that would still be relevant. So for example, on the right-hand side under 4th session, how to help the school committeemen secure the best teacher for their school. Under the 5th session, gradation and certification of teachers, things we still think about. What I want to point out is this item that's on the left-hand side at 12 o'clock. Best method of collecting and managing the special tax fund. We go from 7 of these tax districts in 1899 to 402 in 1906 to 1534 in 1913. So what are these local tax districts? Well, it's a way to, not surprisingly, it's to supplement the funds that are coming from the state. And in the annual reports, or the biannual reports, I should say, that are submitted by the state superintendent to the General Assembly, the state superintendent says that in the newly established local tax districts, of course, the school term has been greatly lengthened, and in many instances,
I'm sorry, sorry to interrupt, Ann, but we have someone who's not on mute. Board members, can we make sure all of us are on mute if we're not actively talking? Thank you.
And so you can imagine what happens here, that local tax districts are formed where there's the capacity to do so, and of course they're not where they can't. So you might imagine the kind of discrepancies we start seeing in the ability to hold a longer term or other qualities standards that we have for education. And indeed, this is exacerbated by the public school appropriations. And here's an example where the funds that are sent for each Black student is less than half of what is sent for white students. Now, as a matter of history, we always want to know, how did this happen? Was this an unintentional consequence of how something was structured, or was it a seeking of intentional inequity? And in this case, we have an answer to this. We have these extraordinary state archives where we can go back and look at the correspondence, something that quite honestly would be difficult to do these days. And here's a letter that is written by J.Y. Joyner to a local superintendent who's inquiring about the cost for building schools for Blacks.
The Negro schools can be run for much less expense and should be. In most places, it does not take more than 1/4 as much to run the Negro schools as it does to run the white schools for about the same number of children. Salaries paid teachers are very properly much smaller. Houses are cheaper, the number of teachers smaller. If quietly managed, the Negroes will give no trouble about it.
That would be the seeking inequity. And indeed, even in the state superintendent's own biennial report, the report included in that by the state agent for Negro rural schools for North Carolina reports the following. And I'm going to read this in case there are those of you who don't have access to the slides. The average Negro rural schoolhouse is really a disgrace to an independent, civilized people. These schoolhouses, though mute, would tell in unmistakable terms a story of injustice, inhumanity, and neglect on the part of our white people. Such a condition would appear to an observer uninformed of our past as intolerable, indefensible, unbusinesslike, and above all, unchristian. And it is with all of this that perhaps we can see these words a little differently. This is a sticker that was put inside of textbooks across North Carolina, the final words of Governor Aycock, which were equal. That is the word. The equal right of every child born on earth to have the opportunity to burgeon out all that is there within him. What about this literacy test? Well, the North Carolina Supreme Court found it valid and went further to say it would not be amiss to say that this constitutional amendment providing for an educational test brought light out of darkness as to education for all the people of the state. Religious, educational, and material uplift went forward by leaps and bounds. So just to pause here on the North Carolina Constitution as it relates to voting, this is our Article 6 out of our Constitution, Section 1. This is the Section 4 that I've been sharing with you. And interestingly, it is still in our Constitution. It was ratified on August 2, 1900 by a vote of 59% in favor of it. And when we sought to rewrite our Constitution by large measure in 1969, it was offered as a separate amendment to the Constitution to remove this, but those voting against abolishing the literacy requirement was 56%. So it remains in our Constitution. It is, of course, not valid because of federal law, but North Carolina would still hold it to be true. And indeed, it's interesting that it is just above this provision that we have an additional restriction on voting, which is to present photo ID upon voting. Those in favor of this requirement was also around that 55%. And once again, federal courts have intervened to say that this is not constitutional. So this is a bit dark. And so one of the things that I think is so remarkable before I finish up this time period is that there were moments of light, pieces of light going on during this time period. And one of them came about because of what was called the Jeans Teacher Fund. So I mentioned before the impact of Northern philanthropy coming into North Carolina after the Civil War. Well, during this time period in the early 1900s, when it's obvious that the state here and elsewhere was not going to meet the needs of Black students, Northern philanthropy again came onto the scene to say we need to do better. And one of the ideas was to fund teacher positions that would go to serve students in these schools that were, our schools were segregated, so these would be teachers that would go to Black schools. Virginia Estelle Randolph is a teacher in Virginia. She is, by the way, recognized nationally and internationally as a leading innovative educator. She believed in what we would now call project-based learning. And here was a description of her at the time. Here was a teacher who thought of her work in terms of the welfare of the whole community and of the school as an agency to help the people to live better, to do their work with more skill and intelligence, and to do it in the spirit of neighborliness. But that's the model of a Jeans teacher. And the question was, how would we get these Jean teachers in North Carolina? It would be a force behind seeking to bring those funds here. Because the reality is, these teachers would then be hired by the local school system. The State Department of Public Instruction had an important role in coordinating this effort. So there had to be a push for this. Well, the push came from Dr. Aaron Moore, a physician in Durham, who was also co-founder of the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. And in a letter to J.Y. Joyner, dated April 26, 1915, he says, if given a chance, the Rosenwald and Jeans funds may be counted on to do much towards the elimination of the faults of our rural schools and introduce a better day for the youth of our state. So as an example of the work of these amazing Jeans teachers, who, by the way, were almost always Black women, here is Carrie T. Jordan, Jeans teacher in Durham. Her 1923-24 annual report is the only one that exists from all the Jeans teachers in North Carolina for all of the years. And here's part of what she says. We found many of the schoolhouses in such poor condition that they really were unfit for use. By explaining to the patrons in these communities the splendid offer of Mr. Rosenwald to assist them in obtaining new buildings, much interest was aroused. And by this, let me just explain, the Rosenwald schools, you have, I'm sure, all heard of them, but it was a deal. Rosenwald, who was the CEO of Sears Roebuck, would contribute some money. The Black community would contribute some money. The white school system would agree to the school being a part of the school system and would agree that the school would be held to certain quality standards to enable some assurance that Blacks going to these schools would get a quality education. So in order to do this, she says, of course it has meant hard work, many community meetings on weekends and evenings with quite a few educational rallies held on Sundays. The meetings held in this connection served a dual purpose, securing new buildings and giving opportunity to stress important matters pertaining to education and homemaking. And so during this bleak time, when the state is intentionally seeking inequity, we have this other, once again, multiracial effort to bring about equity for children. And indeed, North Carolina has more Jeans teachers than any state other than Virginia. And because we have so many Jeans teachers, North Carolina has more Rosenwald schools than any other state. And if you were to have one thing that I would love to see on your action list, it would be to find a way to come back with this idea of the Jeans teachers, teachers who are paid to be in the community, to work with students and their communities on Saturdays with projects or at rallies. It would really be extraordinary. And so with that, I'm at another pause, and Dr. Ford, I'd be happy to answer questions, or Paul said that y'all have a moment to share any observations with each other.
So you have about another 10 minutes left sort of in the window, so it'd be my preference to kind of go through the next portion, and then we'll open it up to have all the questions at the same time.
Okay, perfect. So 1956 is the next time period. For those of us in education, we're used to probably thinking of 1954, which is the when Brown versus Board is announced, at least the first decision. But 1956 is when North Carolina has to take action. So as a reminder, Plessy versus Ferguson stands for the separate but equal, satisfies the 14th Amendment. We all know that that doesn't really happen. But what I really want to focus on moving into this is the Harlan dissent. So to this majority opinion written by the court in Plessy versus Ferguson, Justice Harlan has a lone dissent, and he says the following.
But in view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior dominant ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. The humblest is the peer of the most powerful. The destinies of the two races in this country are indissolubly linked together, and the interests of both require that the common government of all shall not permit the seeds of race hate to be planted under the sanction of law.
And so when Brown versus Board is announced May 17, 1954, what they're really doing is accepting the dissent opinion of Plessy versus Ferguson, that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. It's a good reminder that you can be in the dissent at one time and be in the majority opinion at another. And in North Carolina, this means that there is action pretty quickly to try and influence the direction of the state. From the NAACP, we have the following.
May I take this opportunity to remind you that the May 17 decision of the United States Supreme Court announced the principle of constitutional law in clear and unmistakable terms, that segregated public schools are violative of the Constitution of the United States. It seems to us that this places upon our highest state officials a solemn duty of making immediate plans to conform the school system of North Carolina to the principle enunciated by the Supreme Court.
The governor responds.
I cannot agree that the questions and problems arising from the decision of the Supreme Court are as simple or as easy to solve as you indicated in your letter. I do not think the State Board of Education should or will reconsider its announcement with reference to the opening of the schools next fall.
And so during this time period, right after the decision, we're used to thinking about what the history is, but imagine a fresh start at this time and what might be possible. And that's what Alex Rivera, a photojournalist with the Pittsburgh Courier, but based out of Durham, focuses on. He does a series of reports, and here's some of the headlines of his articles.
Teacher proves integration can work in Tar Heel School. Integration, it does work. U.S. teachers vote yes on integration. Dover High School integrated without any trouble at all. Segregation in West Virginia education is as dead as the dodo bird.
And for these articles, he is given the Global News Syndicate Award. That's him on the far right, receiving the award. In case the person next to him looks a little familiar to you, that indeed is Nixon. School desegregation is the big story, and here's the way this front page article begins.
The year 1954 was one whale of a year. More than a century of struggle for the Negro climaxed in the May 17 United States Supreme Court decision outlawing segregation in the nation's public schools. The grim, eventful aftermath of this ruling is slowly but surely taking its toll of never say die bigots, and signs point to a more fruitful life for all Americans in a climate made healthier by the lawful elimination of segregation.
Not all people saw it this way. In this newspaper, I found in the files of Dr. Wesley Kritz George, a professor in the anatomy department at UNC Medical School. From the 1940s, during the time of World War II, he was espousing beliefs that there were biological differences between the races. He issues a 7-page paper at the time of the Brown decision, and here are several excerpts out of this article.
Because of the friendly feeling that I have for Negroes, especially many Negro friends, whom I hold in esteem and affectionate regard, it is with reluctance that I call attention to weaknesses common in the race. But since multitudes of Negroes have joined together with others in pressure groups to force on us national programs that would mean calamity to our posterity, there seems to be no honorable choice but to inform the public of what appears to be in store for us if we yield to these pressures. The proposal to mix the races in our schools involves far more fundamental questions than whether white and Negro children will get along amicably together or will fight. When we bring young people of the two races together in intimate social relationship, we promote the protoplasmic mixing of the races. This will result, as generations come and go, in the production of an ever-increasing proportion of mixed-breed people and a lessening of pure strains. In my judgment, one of the consequences will be the deterioration and probable destruction of the creative genius of our people.
So it's not surprising where this 7-page paper shows up. Here's some of the different correspondence he has in his files regarding this paper.
Association of Citizens Councils of Mississippi. National Association for Advancement of White People Incorporated. Constitution of White Men Incorporated. Society for Relief of the Unworthy Poor.
What's more remarkable for our purposes is the places that it came into regular government. And here's the first of those letters.
Your stand on segregation will, in my humble judgment, reflect more credit on the University of North Carolina than anything that has happened in many years. Feel at liberty, please, to suggest to me at any time how I can help you in your fine work.
That's from Rodman, Chairman of the Finance Committee of the General Assembly.
I have greatly enjoyed reading your article entitled Race, Heredity, and Civilization. The article is an excellent contribution to this subject, and I hope it will be widely read.
I, Beverly Lake, Assistant Attorney General.
I have read with much interest your statement entitled Race, Heredity, and Civilization.
Sam Irvin, U.S. Senate.
Some time ago, you were gracious enough to send me a copy of your paper, Race, Heredity, and Civilization. It is excellent and quite thought-provoking. As we are face-to-face with this in our Charlotte School Board, I would like to have 12 copies of this paper for use with our school board and administration.
And so indeed, we start moving into the state response. We establish a committee, and there is the People Assignment Act of 1955, which provides for voluntary separation of the races and for moving decision-making to the local level. Here is Governor Hodges.
In spite of this outstanding record of good race relationships here in North Carolina, we are being made the object of a campaign by an organization which seems determined to destroy our interracial friendship and divide us into camps of racial antagonism. This organization is known as the NAACP. Those who would force this state to choose between integrated schools and the abandonment of the public school system will be responsible if, in the choice, we lose the public school system.
Rivera responds.
The Negro knows that much of his progress is due directly to the relentless struggle of the NAACP to secure his rights. They know that the NAACP fought lynching to a standstill, beat the lily white primaries, knocked out the all-white juries, won equal salaries for Negro teachers, removed the curtain from trained diners, had declared unconstitutional the restrictive covenant in housing, paved the way for integration in the military, opened the doors of the state universities, and provided other opportunities too numerous to mention. For 50 years, the Negro begged for equal facilities guaranteed him under the will-o'-the-wisp, separate but equal law. What did he get for his trouble? Insults, threats, and an educational system that has sealed the genius of generations of Americans.
And yet what we see is further correspondence between Hodges and George.
I appreciate your expression of confidence, and I will be grateful for anything that can be done to help make successful this program of voluntary separate school attendance. Dr. George, I think there was a leak somewhere, and possible from a newspaper. I am not sure about this.
So 2 letters within a month. And now we have a new organization on the scene, Patriots of North Carolina. Here's what it says about the new organization.
The purpose of this movement is to encourage the maintenance of the purity and culture of the white race and of Anglo-Saxon institutions. Our desire is to give an intelligent, influential, and organized leadership to which the people as a whole can rally and support with confidence. Please note that 356 incorporators signed the charter representing 59 counties.
And one of the members is Dr. George. And indeed, he is on the first board and is made the president of the organization. And it is not much later that we find the connection being made publicly between Hodges and the Patriots. And where we headed in North Carolina, well, here's a sign of it on December 14, 1955.
We believe that the task before us is to see to preserve education itself, not just the public school system. We believe that history will record that the friends of education in this trying time were those who took a realistic view of this problem and were willing, if necessary, to try new and drastic measures in order to preserve education for all our people. We recognize the possibility that as a last-ditch measure, the public school system might be abolished, fine though it is.
It might sound familiar to you to what we were willing to do after the Civil War. And indeed, the report that comes out, the final report, shows a 2-part concept. It starts actually with a voluntary segregation, and then it has a safety valve that allows for publicly funded grants to attend non-sectarian schools to avoid a child attending a school with mixed races, something we would probably now call a voucher. And it also allows to a local unit to suspend operation of the public schools. In order to effectuate this, it's going to be a change in the Constitution. So the governor calls for a special session, a joint session of the General Assembly, and the Attorney General works out having an election solely for this purpose. So the intent is to have this election in September before November elections, where there will be other issues on the ballot. And opinions start coming in about this Pearson Plan, as it was called. The Patriots strongly support it. And here's one from an anonymous that I normally wouldn't say, but I think that it has an important message, and here it is.
Due to family and political reasons, I cannot sign this letter. Furthermore, if I see you tomorrow, I will assume the obsequious role required of a man in my position. At least, I am not deceiving myself. I am a hypocrite, and I know it. You may convince yourself that you are on the side of truth and right, but don't ever think that you will fool the historians of the future. They will see you for what you are, one of a group of misguided souls that fought sincerely, but nevertheless in ignorance and without foresight, to hold back the progress of a great nation.
And the last one that I want to share with you before you hear the speech from Hodges, this is Irving Carlisle, who had been president of the North Carolina Bar Association.
In the atmosphere largely created here at Chapel Hill and by our public schools, the people of North Carolina are accustomed to making up their own minds on public questions, from the mandatory duty to operate free public schools for all of the children to the permissive privilege to close them in any given locality is a long backward step that ought never to be taken by North Carolina. As we struggle with this problem of the races, we should always remember that we now live in a changing world that is a community made up of peoples that are preponderantly non-white. To live with our consciences, we must be willing to let others live up to the rights given to them by law.
So the sessions of the drafts of the constitutional amendments are released, and we come to the special session. This is the last recording that you will hear, and we're very close to the end of the slides, just a few slides after this. So this is the actual recording that we've been able to piece together a couple of minutes out of a 30-minute speech.
Mr. President, Mr. Speaker, and members of the General Assembly, we face tonight one of the greatest crises which North Carolina has ever experienced, and affecting at this moment the lives of over 1 million school children in our state. Do not expect us to stand idly by, as some have suggested, while our public schools are ruined in the course of a sociological experiment sought to be carried out at the expense of our children. Let us consider for a few minutes the original source of the trouble that has made this special meeting of the General Assembly necessary. I refer, of course, to the Supreme Court of the United States and its school segregation decision. As you know, the 1954 decision by the Supreme Court overturned an interpretation of some 60 years standing, based upon the 14th Amendment by that court, to the effect that separate but equal facilities did not violate the terms of equal protection contained in that amendment. We're going to use every legal means we can devise to ensure the effect that what we feel is an erroneous decision by the Supreme Court are not forced on this state in a fashion which would deprive us of our dearest possessions, namely our public schools. We believe the overwhelming majority of parents can be relied upon to do what they think is best for their children. Furthermore, if conditions are ever so bad in a community that the people will vote to suspend the operation of their school, then conditions are so bad that the schools couldn't be operated successfully anyhow. Let me again make my position clear. I do not agree with the Supreme Court decision, and I think it usurped the rights of the states and the Congress in its decision. I do not favor mixing the races in the schools, and I believe the vast majority of white and colored citizens feel the same as I do.
So based on that, we lead towards an election. Solely on the Pearson Plan, there's a significant campaign to educate folks. I'm going to skip over that last speech. This is the way the amendment looks on the ballot. The public votes on the Pearson Plan for or against, and it's ratified by people 82%. Now, this is a reminder, this is before the Voting Rights Act, and the percentage of blacks voting is still quite low. And that's the end of my history, and I'm going to turn it back over. I'm going to close on this slide. This is from the Innovation Project. I'm co-founder and president. And the presentation you've just heard is a part of our thinking about how we want to be in this space of education transformation. We had a grant from Z. Smith Reynolds for this summer to work on design, and we were so thrilled to have Dr. Ford and Freeburg McKinney join us in that work. This is kind of our path forward, and you will see a lot of what I've been talking about is included in the labyrinth in the beginning. And we have reached the point that we really think it's crucial to have this understanding in order to move into the design in a co-creative way. And that if we don't do this work, then we really can't strategize, activate, and sustain a kind of design that will lead to thriving young people and thriving communities. So, Dr. Ford, that concludes my presentation. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Absolutely. And before I open it up for questions and commentary, let me just take a moment again to say thank you, Anne, for your work and for what is truly a rare gift, and you sharing that with us as board members. You have covered almost 100 years of history in a very short amount of time. You've done so in a way that is thorough. You've taken us through many hidden figures in our state, shone a light on some of the really highlights that often go underappreciated, and you've also exposed some of the darker corners and the contours of our history and the legacy of white supremacy, an often contested term, right? And the indisputable history of how we've struggled with the issues that we face today. And so I thank you for that. So as I open it up to board members, if I could just play teacher for a moment and leave with a question prompt that I would often say to my students, and that is, you know, if the premise that history is a predictor of the future has any weight, what ways are we seeing this history repeat itself in our present context, perhaps in a different time period, a different population, et cetera? And what use might this information be to us as a body, as the State Board of Education, as we execute our State Board of Education strategic plan? And so with that, I open the floor to my colleagues. This is referred to as wait time in the classroom.
Mr. Ford, if I may.
Yes, you may. Go ahead, Mr. Bristow-Smith.
Well familiar with wait time. Well done. Dr. McCall, this is Matt Bristow-Smith from Edgecombe County, and one of the aspects of your presentation today that I most appreciate is your use of primary documents and the words and writings of our very own North Carolinians to capture the deep roots of historical injustice and inequity in North Carolina governance and education. You've also, though, captured in sharp relief the tension and trajectory of our moral arc toward a more level playing field, which I know everyone on this board believes in. You've noted that we are once again at a pivot point in our state's journey towards equity, and I want to ask if you could foresee a time 50 to 100 years from now in which our successors might look back on this moment in history that we're currently in, on our equity resolution, on our framework for action, on the state board strategic plan to eliminate opportunity gaps. And could you foresee a time in which subsequent generations might measure our work today with the same level of historical gravity that your presentation brought today? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. I think we have a choice ahead of us right now. We can think of this as Reconstruction 2020. There is so much disruption to the education system brought about by COVID. The murder of George Floyd brings a deeper awareness for everyone of the racial injustices that persist. It's just an extraordinary time, and I'm confident that historians will look back to 2020 and see how people chose to act. And certainly you as a state board have been taking steps to position yourself in a way to act with great strength on issues of equity and learner-centered.
Thank you, Mr. Bristow-Smith. Any other questions from my colleagues? Ms. McCall. Are you sure? This is a rare occasion, so just wanted to make sure no one has any questions. We are in a very small minority of folks who get this information.
Mr. Ford.
Yes, sir, Mr. Hall.
Thank you. I muted myself while you were talking. But anyway, it's not a question, it's more of a statement for Dr. McCall. Dr. McCall, thank you so much. Thank you so much for what you have shared with us this morning. I don't know if Dr. Ford can take much more right now. Because I've heard this before from you, but not in this detail, not in this length. And I just want to thank you for that, for you filled in a lot of spots that I've often thought about. Excuse me. But for me, you have brought us from the past to the present, and you have certainly given us a path to the future. of what we can and should be doing as a citizen of the state and as a state board member. And I personally want to thank you and Mr. Ford for bringing you to the table to share with us. Right now, I'm reading a book. I can stop reading it. You've already shared what this book is talking about in a short period of time. Thank you so much, Dr. McCall, and may you be more successful in your work in the years ahead.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Ford, this is Olivia.
Yes, please proceed, Dr. Oxendale.
Thank you very much. I love education history, and when I first, right after I was appointed to the board, I spent about 3 hours over in the third floor of the archives building reading all about the State Board of Education. And I remember having to wear gloves and being very careful with those very fragile documents. My question is this. Much of what you have presented to us today is from the mid-1800s, the beginning of...
Dr. Oxendale, I'm sorry, can I cut in just for a moment? I hear someone speaking, and it's making it difficult to hear you.
Okay.
I think that we've muted, so I'm sorry, proceed.
Nobody's in my house. I'm unmuted. I have to look around and check. But prior to the beginning of the Civil War on to 1956 and the Pearson Plan, and I'm fascinated by that plan. I've read it a few times. But the laws, society was very different then, and especially in the South, because of laws on the books that ensured and insisted that the races stay separate in school and in society. I think about the Jim Crow ways of living during the early 1900s, maybe even before then. So things were so defined in writing about the separation of the races. That isn't the case today, because we've turned some corners beginning in the late 1960s, early 70s, and on through the 70s with school integration. So I'm not minimizing the need for doing the right thing by people and by kids, because my story could fall right in line with what you shared today. But I want to ask you this. What do you think? Someone asked this question in a different way just a minute ago, some perhaps being repetitive. What do you think, given the fact that we have turned some corners in terms of race relations in this country and in North Carolina, what will the story about inequity be like in 20 years?
Thank you for the question. I think part of the story of, there's a couple of aspects of the 1901 story that I think are really important. One is the force with which they sought inequity. It didn't just happen. And so if we want to do the opposite, we want to seek equity, we have to do it with at least the same level of intention. And that's where I think sometimes I will observe work being done, and it strikes me that it's more at a programmatic level rather than checking on the issues around systems and structures that persist in creating some barriers. And so it's that willingness to fully embrace an issue down to the level of the systems and structures. The other is that when we see those efforts at inequity, it's done in lots of different ways. So some of it was legal, some of it was putting laws on the book, some of it was social and economic. And so, the whole giving less money to the schools for blacks was a very intentional economic choice to try and maintain a patriarchal perspective where the white structure was deciding what would be given. And so we have to be mindful of all the different kinds of structures that can persist: social, cultural, legal, economic, and make sure that we are really thinking about all of them, because they've all been used in the past and all of them have been a part of creating these structures that we need to undo. I know in your equity resolution, you acknowledge that there have been these structures that have been built. So this is a part of our effort, is to really pay attention.
Mr. Ford? Is that Mr. Keenan out here?
Yes, it is.
All right, please proceed.
I'd like to just comment, particularly with Dr. Oxendine's question about what do you see in 20 years. One thing I like about the presentation a few minutes ago is that the fact that when you got a chance now to decide, do you want to be like those folks that many years ago, or do you want to make a difference? So I think it's good to sometimes go back to history and see how we got where we are, because that, I think that's a question a lot of us need to ask. Do you want our world to be like it was back in the 50s and 60s and before? Or do we want to make a difference? And that's the question I think we're dealing with today. What do I see in 20 years? Unless we begin to have these discussions as we're doing today and a lot in the last few months, I see not much progress going to be made in race relations until we begin to communicate, begin to talk it out, begin to understand one another. And we must also realize we can't continue to step on others, regardless of the race. A lot of times it's based on socioeconomics. Sometimes the wealthier sometimes step on the oppressed smaller. But I guess 20 years from now, I do see some bright lights ahead, provided we continue to communicate and look at our history. And as Ms. Oxendine said, we have turned the corner. I do a little bit. We've turned the corner. We've got a long way to go. Let's keep on turning the corner so we can get around the corner. But I do see a bright future for all of us who are willing to change from the way we used to be and for as treating humanity. And again, as a man of integrity, I myself and others want to continue to advocate mankind to make it better. And we can do that if we really, within our heart, want to do that. We can change. And again, Ms. Oxendine, I think there's a bright future for all of us. So let's you and I and others walk together to make this world a better place. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, thank you, Mr. Keenan, and what a beautiful segue and conclusion from that historical sort of survey of our state. And as a setup for where we've been and where we need to go and building bridges, again, I just want to reiterate our thanks to you, Ms. McCall, as we get ready to prepare for looking what that future looks like and hearing from folks who are presently a part of our school system. We have an excellent panel with folks who are in the work presently. So we have a panel of both students and educators. Our panelists are Mr. LaShawn Jenkins, assistant principal at Tarboro High School and Edgecombe County Public Schools. Mr. Elijah Sellers, who is a high school junior at the North Carolina School of Science and Math, Future Imagine. Mr. Kenai Gunter, high school senior from Tarboro High School, and as well as Miss Kadisha Stewart, who's a teacher at Pinkston Street Elementary. Mr. Edward Ortega, who's a principal at LB Yancey Elementary, and Ms. Kim Meza, who's an ESL Title III and Migrant Director. And to facilitate that dialogue, we'll have none other than Dr. Townsend Smith. And so the floor is now yours, Dr. Townsend Smith.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ford, and thank you so much to our illustrious panel that has agreed to speak with us today. Am I coming through loud and clear? All right. I am so excited to have, well, we are so excited to have you here today. Enjoyed engaging in conversations with you prior to this meeting today. As Mr. Ford stated, for the record, these participants in this panel today are coming to us from Edgecombe County and Vance County, respectively. And so as we start, we want to start with our Edgecombe County participants. And I want you to spend a little bit of time to tell us about yourself and who are you and the role that you are currently serving.
So I'll start. It's about afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is LaShawn Jenkins, and I am the assistant principal, the proud assistant principal at Tarboro High School. This is my 20th year in the district here in Edgecombe County. I spent 16 years here at Tarboro High School as a history teacher, and I spent 2 years away at another school in the district, and so I have returned to Tarboro High School last year. So technically, this is my 18th year service here at Tarboro High School, and I'm just happy and excited to be part of this panel discussion today.
Hello, I'm Elijah Sellers. I am currently a North Carolina junior at the North Carolina School of Science and Math. I am connected with Mr. Jenkins. He used to be my assistant principal, and I miss him every day. But yeah, I'm so excited to be a part of this conversation and to share my view as a student in our educational system to help build upon the great plans that you guys have already put in place. So thank you.
I'm Keenan. I'm a senior at Tarboro High, and I'm just happy to be here and to share my opinion as a student. Anything.
Thank you so much from Edgecombe County, and so I would like for the representatives from Vance County to now introduce themselves. Same question to you, and then we will dig into the questions that we have for you here today.
Good afternoon. I'll go ahead and get started. I'm Kim Mesa. I'm the ESL Title III Migrant Director for Vance County Schools. I'm in my 21st year in this position, but my 33rd year in education, with 32 of those being here in Vance County. I'm very excited to be here this afternoon. I enjoy working with my ESL and migrant families, and I'm always excited to talk about that.
Hello, my name is Kedesia Stewart-Faines. I'm an educator from Vance County Schools. I am an assistant principal at Vance County Middle School. I have served 15 years in education thus far. This is my 8th year in Vance County. I am originally from Jamaica. I got here 8 years ago on the international teaching program, and I've been in Vance County. I'm looking forward to serving in whatever capacity that I can so that I can help to improve the conditions and the quality of education in the state of North Carolina.
My name is Ortega. I'm the proud principal of LBNC Elementary. This is my first year as a principal here. I served in this school as an assistant principal for the last 2 years, and I have been in education for 17 years. And out of those 17 years, 14 actually here in Vance County. I used to be an ESL teacher, love being an ESL teacher, still in contact with my roots as an ESL teacher, helping families as much as I can, and also helping families now as a different capacity as a principal. And I would be, I'm proud to be here with you all today.
All right. So thank you so much for your introductions. We are looking forward to this conversation. As we communicated to all of you, this is an opportunity for you to share your candid and honest reflections with the board in your responses. You don't have to be shy, so this is your opportunity to share here today. So we're going to begin with the adults first before we get to students. But just reflecting on, you've seen the board's action framework, you've seen the strategic plan components. You've also seen the recent resolutions of equity and whole child. And so as you are operating in your district, how does your district or school promote a culture of high expectations? And if the Vance and Edgecombe County professionals will begin to respond to that question, that would be great.
Well, I'm going to start. I think Vance County has done I mean, it's paving the way in probably the state with this. Back in 2016, when Dr. Jackson introduced the strategic roadmap for the district, and I believe this map has as an intention is creating the guidelines for all of our schools in the county to move forward and to reach out and have these clear expectations. The strategic roadmap has clear goals that are aiming to increase participation of every child in our schools. One specific example that I can tell you about this is that the state basically, I mean, the district surpassed the state graduation rate because of these efforts of us all being involved and with the culture of high expectations. Also, the district is rethinking, reimagining, and reforming the way we approach education based on our new, current guidelines because of COVID.
And I'll just continue with that what Edward just said. When our district came up with those strategic plans, they were in line with what the state and findings from the Leandro case. They were somewhat aligned, and so even though he spoke of the graduation rate, which has improved tremendously because the foundation was laid, I think that's a big role in setting the precedence for how a district moves, is by having a sturdy foundation which is rooted and grounded on the principles and the needs of the people that we serve and the demographics that we serve. I think that is how we have and we promote the culture of high expectation, because we have a foundation that is rooted in serving people and catering to the needs of the community that we are in, and being intentionally lining up that with the ideals of the state.
And just to piggyback on what Mr. Ortega and Ms. Stewart shared, I think with the high focus on quality teaching and ongoing professional development is another major factor. And also thinking about just my group that I work with, my ESL and migrant, our subgroup of the LEP also had a graduation rate that exceeded the state, so we're very proud about that.
In terms of Edgecombe County, one thing that I'm really, really proud about here in Edgecombe is that we established years ago an equity mission statement, and in that equity mission statement are priority standards, and the very first priority standard is academic excellence. And I think that from a district perspective, as that matriculates down into all the schools in our district, that it has been established at the highest level that academic excellence is our priority. And so when we unpack that priority standard, we look at like creating more personalized student-centered learning environments, making sure that students have access to rigorous and grade level content, and just making sure that like our children begin their personalized journey as learners even before they enter school. And so I think that's key. So that once every school, and the good thing is every school has the autonomy to really create their own cultures around academic excellence. But I think the fact that our district has prioritized it from the top, it places the responsibility on school leaders to make sure that we continue that vision that's been handed down from the vision. And so here at Edgecombe, I mean, there are so many things that I could mention right now that are direct product of that priority standard and the academic excellence. I mean, I think that every school in our district, now I won't say I know, every school in our district has been able to celebrate something around student achievement and student excellence as it relates to like our priority standard of academic excellence here in Edgecombe.
Thank you so much for your responses today. And I'm going to raise a question for our students from their perspective, and then see if there are any follow-up questions from board members. So, Mr. Gunter and Mr. Sellers, you've heard representatives talk about how in their role they set a culture of high expectations. Can you explain to us in any way about how your school or district sets high expectations, yet allows you to use your voice to influence what actually happens, or to influence that practice at the school?
For me personally, I could say that in class, all the students, they build a bond with their teacher or a relationship, and they always offer us after school help, and we talk to them, give them input how class can work or what can go into class or what we need help with, and whatever we say, they take it into consideration, and then we all talk with the class, and we all decide.
I agree, and I think that every school that I have been a part of, they make it seem, or they are really good at making sure that students have a voice, right? They continue to have open discussions with students where we're able to express what we're thinking, and to influence the policies that the school implements around us, right? I know at Tarboro High School, having groups that are distinct for each child, and having them come up with like their own norms and building great connections with like the principals and assistant principals, it makes it seem that we are very empowered and that we have a voice, right? At NCSSM, having student government, right, and having kids actually listen to you and then present these ideas to teachers and to like the chancellor and so much more, we are able to fully engage in the process of creating equity, right? And by no means is any system perfect, right, or any setup that we have super excellent, but it is a system that I say has worked thus far, and that I'm glad that we are able to talk about it and continue to improve it.
Thank you so much. Board members, are there any follow-up questions to this thread of questioning that we're asking on a culture of high expectations before we move on? Ms. White?
To the students, my question would be, how important would you place the message of high expectations as a message coming from an established system such as school versus the importance of high expectations being promoted within your family unit? And by family unit, that could be grandparent, parent, siblings, but how important do you think that messaging is? And is it more important coming from the school or more important coming from the home?
I would say that that the school they continue to set guidelines and outline platforms and plans that encourage us to do our best. And I can say that without the help from home, then these guidelines cannot be met, right? So I'm a strong advocate for teacher, parent, students relationships, right, and making sure that those relationships are super strong, so that way students can succeed at home and in the classroom. I think anytime where a teacher or a principal or anybody is sitting you down and asking you your opinion, and building those connections, that is a strong foundation for expectations, right? When you know more about your student, you're able to create bars that you want your students to achieve, right? So those connections are key and fundamental, and I think all of the schools I have been a part of have done such an amazing job of that.
So me personally, I'm a senior. So right now,
Mr. Gunter, are you still there? We might have to reconnect you again. We will give him the opportunity to finish that question.
Dr. Townsend Smith, I think it's no secret that broadband in rural North Carolina sometimes has its ups and downs. So I think we've lost Gunter for now, but he's trying to dial back in.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to continue with you, Mr. Sellers, and just continue this thread that you were outlining about the support that you receive from home based on the question that Ms. White just asked, and just talk to you about the things that your school does to support you academically or outside of school, and then follow that up with why is that so important, and just what do you think is missing, and potentially what can we do as a state to support you in your area?
That's a great question. I think that whenever, again, those connections are important. And I think that's what has driven the expectations that teachers set. I think when principals like Mr. Jenkins host events for students after school and invest in us with like college applications and so much more, those are examples of setting expectations, right? Of showing that I believe in you and I believe that you can reach a bar, right? A bar that that you deserve to reach, right? I think what we should do better of is I think we should just outline it better, right? Making sure that every student is a part of that, because there are many students who shy away from their goals, or many students who don't feel like they're connected within the system, right? There are many students who are not above average student and or the best behaving student, and at times they can feel as if their voice doesn't matter, right? And it's important to hear from all students and all perspectives when setting goals, right? And I think honestly that our education system should continue to advocate for a more personalized system that that is set up upon each student's needs and is specific to each student when we talk about expectations. So I think, like I said, our system is not perfect and it certainly can be improved, but we have taken huge steps, and these huge steps can lead into something that is extraordinary for each student.
Well, I'm going to keep you on the hot seat here because you're doing such a wonderful job. So tell us how does your school, the district make sure that you see yourself reflected in the materials that you study each day, and then just explain why is that important from your perspective as a student.
Yes, certainly. I think the school, there are a lot of different people within any school, right? And it's important to highlight each and every part of your identity when in education, right? And when building an environment that is safe for students. I can say that at Tarboro High, we have a large student population that is Black, right? And much of our teachings should be essential. They should surround the identity of Black students, right? I think there have been huge steps to make that a part of our curriculum, right? And spotlighting like Black scientists and Black mathematicians. I think also there's like a lack of representation within these fields, right? And stressing the importance of like of pushing students into these areas and being trendsetters and trailblazers, right? I think also that there are identities that are not represented when we talk about education. Many identities that are underrepresented also, right? So just making sure that your curriculum can change, or knowing that your curriculum can change when students walk through the door is important, right? Because what you planned by yourself is not going to reach every student within that classroom, right? And when you meet these students or the ones walking into your classrooms, you can set an expectation that meets them, right? And I think that's important. Yeah.
Love your passion and love your responses. Board members, before I continue this the line of questioning.
Yeah, Mr. Gunner back. Yeah.
Mr. Gunter, can you hear me now? Try that one more time. We're going to get you back. We're going to get you back. We know that. All right, we'll come back to you. Board members, any other questions before I continue?
Dr. Townsend Smith, I have a question for Elijah.
Sure, go ahead.
Elijah, you've made reference to a number of schools that you've attended. Most recently, you've moved from Tarboro High School to the North Carolina School of Science and Math, where I'm sure doors of opportunity have opened up for you. I want to ask if you could speak not to what you have seen that has worked well in your education system, but I want to ask you to speak candidly about what you've seen that hasn't worked well for you or for other students of color along your journey, your educational journey. Please, teach us.
Of course. So many black students don't see themselves within their teachers, and that is essential. There need to be more black teachers who are represented at places like NCSSM. I remember my first week on campus where I was mistaken as like a cafeteria worker or a janitor, because that is the only representation of blackness on the campus of NCSSM, right? And we can teach all day about how we should be equitable or how we should continue to change the mindsets of people. But representation is key. I think there's a lack of representation around the world in a sense. And I know it's going to be hard to like create a system of representation when, there are black people who are not achieving those standards, right? But I think more importantly, it's important to say that you can achieve those standards, right? I'm not sure if that made sense. Let me try to explain it in a different way. I want students of color, to know that no goal that they set is too high, and that they don't have to settle based on the expectations of the less of different-minded people, right? People who don't see you succeeding, and this. I don't think that there is a system that does that, right? There's no person without biases or no person without judgment. But creating that and continuing to have conversations, I think will be the best way to encourage students to step outside of themselves and into positions and places that they didn't see for themselves.
Dr. Townsend Smith, I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Dr.
Thank you very much. And I will, anyone can take this question. See, I am in public education. I teach at a university in an EPP where we train, prepare teachers and principals. And I've been doing this a long, long, long time. So we're not seeing as many teachers of color come through our pipeline. And when I say that, I'm talking about African American, American Indians, Hispanic. They just aren't there. They're going into other fields. So what if that continues to be the trend? Because a minority candidates are saying no to public education, not for negative reasons. Other opportunities are available to them. So what if we can't supply you with teachers of color? How will that, talk about your education then? Anyone?
I'd like to say that I think that's a good point that you bring up. But I'm thinking about, purposeful partnerships, when you look at programs and departments at historically black colleges and universities, and that wasn't my narrative, but that was a narrative of several educators that I know. So, there is a myth that educators of color or future teachers are not out there, and they are there. It may require us to look beyond our typical geographic lens, sort of like we do with our global partnerships with VIF and participate. Also with our partnerships with Teach for America, those type of programs that sometimes allow us to recruit beyond like our geographical lens, and sometimes we're bringing in teachers from different states and different regions and different parts of the world. And so I think that we have to be intentional about the same about the same way in terms of teacher recruitment, particularly teachers of color. So it may require us to step outside of our normal traditional powerhouse educational program that are producing outstanding leaders, not to lower your standard, but to widen your lens, because teachers of color are there. It just may require you to be a little bit more intentional, and it may require you to move differently in terms of your recruitment and in terms of how you identify these prospects that you would hope to groom to be parts of your school.
Thank you. I'm sending a chat note. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We can, is that another
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I think to another part of your question, like what will we lose if we didn't have teachers of colors, right?
Good.
I think one, we lose the experience of culture, right? There's a certain element of connection that is brought from people who look like you. And another thing is, if I am constantly taught by people who don't look like me, do I think I can retain the information and teach it to somebody else? Right? I think that's an important question to look at. Do I think that I'm smart enough to retain information that is constantly taught to me by people who don't look like me, right? Or information that is taught to me that constantly tells me that as a black man in America that I won't succeed, right? Or that statistics state that you're going to end up in prison and different things like this, right? So not only is it important to teach facts, but it's important for us to frame facts in a way that don't shy students away from their greatness. And having the importance of that teacher that can relate, it changes everything, you know? I don't know where I would be in my educational journey without innovators and great leaders like Mr. Jenkins, right? Who told me that I was capable of applying to places like NCSSM, right? And striving outside of the means of what is expected of a black man, right?
And I totally agree with that, Elijah. As a educator from a third world country, I came to teach in Vance County with no knowledge of ever having a teacher that didn't look like me. Everybody that taught me, that was in front of me in a classroom, looked like me. So the level of motivation was different because I had someone who I could directly relate to. I made some notes as you were talking, and it said that motivation flows different when you can directly connect to the person who's feeding you. It is a different experience, and that's why, like my colleague said earlier, you have to be intentionally recruiting minority teachers, teachers of color who can be in those classrooms, who can make that difference. Because when you have someone who can speak that language that you speak, who can share that experience that you have, who can coach you, who can say, okay, I know, I can understand your perspective, but I'm telling you that it is attainable. That makes a whole lot of difference. So if we're going to be intentional about getting more teachers of colors, we have to go to the grassroots, to the places where the deficiencies are, to the places where the needs are, and that is in our rural areas, because we have a lot of potential, but that potential is not being tapped into because of the tradition of how people need to go out and get their own. But what if you don't know? What if you don't know that it is attainable because there's not someone in front of you that can directly say, listen, these are the options, these are the choices. You do not have to choose this path. Look, let me teach you how to. That is something that we really need to look into.
Thank you so much.
I would like to add to that as well that, for instance, like Elijah said and Ms. Stewart said, having somebody who looks like you teach you is extremely important. From experience, I've been teaching in Vance County for 14 years, and I believe right now I'm the first principal, Hispanic principal, Latino principal, not born in the U.S. in the county, and this is huge because now when I go to, out there in the streets, the students, kids that used to be my students are so proud of that. The fact that there's somebody now in a leadership position that can, represent us, giving them an outlet, an option to say, hey, I can actually do that as well. And it's funny enough that now I've seen a lot of kids that used to be my students now going into education. There's a couple of schools now in the district that also now have kids that were my former students, Latino kids, second generation Latino, but still kids that were, my students. So it's getting out there. Having somebody that looks like you gives you an option, an outlet, and tell you, hey, this can be done. So it's extremely important to have people, that represent you, teaching you and working with you.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Good insights.
Would you like to add anything, Mr. Gunter? Because I think I have you back. Just checking.
Dr. Smith.
Yes, sir.
Counselor Smith, I'm sorry.
No, you're fine.
Mr. Wendell Hall.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I was sitting, I just want to make a few comments concerning this issue of teachers of color, and they're hard to find. The governor task force is in place now and is working on just that issue about trying to attract the DRIVE task force, trying to attack ways or find ways to encourage more teachers of color for the same reason that Mr. Sellers has mentioned and others on the broadcast this morning. But Mr. Ortega hit on something that we also are looking at, and that is not only the teachers, but principals of color. Makes a big difference also in the recruitment process, and of course for children. So your point is well taken. It's a valid point. For the first of the year, I think the governor's task force is supposed to give us a final report on some ideas, some ways that we can enhance teachers of color and get more teachers, more individuals to become educators. And I sat here thinking about it, and the students and the principal, you're right on target when it comes to someone being there that looks like them. That's what equity is all about also. But while I have the floor, may I quickly pivot towards the middle school principal. And I don't have your name, sir, before me. But I just want to say to him, would you mind explaining to us, some of us, the culture you have presented, and some people understand what I'm saying, in the Tarboro Power I play. We have tried to defend that play over the years, but you have built into your student body, no matter who they are, they run that play with excellence year in and year out. And you know that I know that 2A ball is nothing without Tarboro. They've always been there. So you don't have to explain it, because I know you're going to give us the details of it. But we haven't stopped it yet. I'm from a hot ski.
It's funny. And of course, my background, I was a former coach, not a former football coach, but I will say that it is so important to incorporate history as a tenet in your school culture. Yeah. And of course, anyone who knows the history, Tarboro has a very interesting history, particularly with integration. There were two separate high schools in 1969, and when they came together in 1970, they both brought a history of football. And so it was because of that. If you speak to the members of that 1970 integration team about what that was like, members from both teams said that it was because of football that allowed for successful racial integration. And because of that, football became a tenet of the foundation here in Tarboro. And that's, of course, that's years and years ago. And so it's one of the things that unify the community. So I think as school leaders, even as we're talking about this whole notion of equity and whole child, it's important that when the kids enter into our buildings, that not only they enter into a building where they know learning can be conducive, but they enter into a building where they see their history embedded into the school culture.
Absolutely. And I thank you for that. So, but one day we're going to figure out how to stop that power rush. So we know it's coming. Thank you, sir.
Dr. Townsend Smith, if I could ask a question on a similar thread.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
I see Mr. Hall trying to figure out plays and secrets, and I appreciate that. On the idea of culture, and I'm just a really quick setup. While in the classroom in North Carolina, in Charlotte, I taught at what was categorically the most diverse high school in the state, Garinger High School. The highest ESL population of any high school in the state. Students coming from all over the globe, from countries in Latin America, all over the continent of Africa, and Southeast Asia. No matter who, and I hope we all can agree, is put in front of a student, the expectation is that schooling be done in a way that responds to and affirms the culture of those students. Given that education is really now global, right? Students coming to us from all over the world, some voluntary immigrants, some involuntary. What can be done or what must be done to ensure that the school system has a proper understanding of students' backgrounds, who they are, where they come from, what they bring with them, and that those things are not diminished or ignored as a part of the education experience? How important is that? And I'll just leave that to the panelists to speak to.
Okay, I'd like to start. I think that's extremely important. The teachers really need to know their students, their background, their culture. It starts with their name, pronouncing their name correctly. We had a situation where we had teachers mispronounce the name, and you correct them and they'd still pronounce it. But we have teachers now who I think are so culturally responsible, and they are very much wanting to know the students, know their backgrounds, know their culture, making sure they're pronouncing their names correctly. We're trying to do some Spanish PD and many Spanish lessons we do through Twitter. We're trying to expand into Arabic also because we have a growing Arabic population. But to answer that question, it's extremely important for the teachers to know those students' relationships are what it's all about. And when you know your child, you know your student, you know their background, you care about them, they know that, they can feel that. And I think it's extremely important.
And I would add to that, Ms. Meza, by saying that on a district level, professional development has to be consistent with the demographics that we serve. So if you know that you have a high ESL population or you have a global population, you have to provide professional development that will give your staff the opportunity to understand how to connect with students of these different backgrounds and cultures. And you also have to make sure that teachers understand what it is to be culturally responsive every day in the classroom. That is very important. You have to train teachers how to be culturally responsive every day in the classroom, how to make it personal for that group of students, how to reach out, how to connect, how to build relationship, and how to maintain that level of high expectation. But again, that comes back to me from a district level that is watered down to your staff, and how you're going to maintain that high level of expectation that all the needs of all students, no matter where they are from, no matter what part of the earth they're from, that those needs are met. And that means that you are going to do some hard work. That means your district now has to look into hard work and making sure that at the core of the work that you do, it's in the how are we supporting the people that we are serving.
I would also like to add that at the same time, that of course we're piling on being culturally responsive, but also celebrating, making sure that we are aware of not stereotyping and celebrate people's culture. Like for example, here at Yancy, we usually don't do like Hispanic Heritage Month celebration or African American Month or this and that. We just have a culture celebration where all the cultures come together on an equal ground, equal footing. No culture is bigger or better than others. We all just sharing where we are and where we come from. And that's a great point of bringing families in as well, because we really have to understand that people need to know that we see them, we acknowledge them, and making sure that you are addressing people, like Ms. Mesa was saying, by their first name, making sure that, by their correct name, not Americanizing no names, absolutely not. And then making sure you're calling people the way they're supposed to be called, and reaching out to them, make sure that information is sent in their home language, whether it is Spanish, Arabic, whatever means has to be necessary, making sure that the school is making people feel welcome and connected by acknowledging their culture, whichever it may be.
I'd just like to add to that and echo some of the sentiments that Mr. Ortega just said. It's along those lines that I am a huge advocate of global curriculum at all levels. I think sometimes as we're having this conversation about the whole child, sometimes we speak to every part of the child except their ethnicity and their culture. And I think that's the most powerful place that you can speak to a child. It reminds me of a quote by Nelson Mandela. It goes something like, if you speak to a man in a language that he understands, you speak to his head. But if you speak to him in his language, you speak to his heart. And so I just believe that when we are immersed in culture at a deep enough level to where not only we see our kids in the hallway, but we can speak to their culture and we can speak to that place and we can speak to their identity beyond the surface, it's at that point that I believe that you can really reach whole child beneath the surface where most people don't have access. And so when you're able to identify all the different cultures, all the different cultures that are assimilated in your building, and not only recognize that, but actually have a cultural capacity to where you can celebrate those kids, I think it just takes your school culture to another level. And so every school that I've ever worked in, there's going to be some level of cultural integration. My district empowered me years ago to write a global studies curriculum, and before we started studying other people, we had to start learning about ourselves, because before you can really immerse kids into that level of culture, there's so many things that our kids don't know about their own culture. And so I think it begins there, and of course I think it matriculates through the students, through the curriculum that you've established in your building.
I feel that teachers have to be more willing to adapt and adjust and get to know the student more. Like Coach Jenkins, he has this program called Game Changers. Like it's not for just black students, but it's really for anybody, but mostly black males come to it. And so I feel that each student has a different background and they've all been through different things day in and day out. So with that, nobody knows really how a student feels unless like they build a bond with somebody and they can actually open up and tell you how they feel or what's going on. And you just have to be willing to connect emotionally.
I agree. I think we should look at, like, what are you preaching as a school if you have teachers who are not receptive to different cultures, right? When you ignore somebody's identity, you are promoting ignorance, right? And it's important as a school system or as a school to make sure that you are shaping young people who feel like they can thrive in our society, right? Our society is not perfect, and our society may preach ignorance, but a school system that shapes a mind and shapes a life, they can change what society is preaching, right? So it's important to take that into consideration as we talk about acknowledging every culture and every part of your identity, because the lack of it tells you that you can't be who you were destined or who you are.
All four responses here today. I think this gives us a great foundation to continue the work that we started. But I'm left with a question surrounding if you had a wish to choose a priority for the board to consider today, to continue to keep our foot on the gas and move that priority forward with everything that we have in us. What would that be and why? Don't be shy.
I'll say this. I'm not sure if this is what you're looking for, but sometimes I believe in just letting, and I guess I just want to share like a personal experience, but I think we should just let data tell the story. Data's not the end of everything, but I think data should tell the story. In some problem of practice research that I did this past year with a teacher, I looked at data, and it said that our African American boys were performing at the very bottom of Math 1 as incoming freshmen. The data said that. I didn't say that. The teacher didn't say that. The data said that. So I was like, you know what? If that's what the data is saying, let's create some diagnostics to fix the problem if there's a problem in practice. I worked with the teacher, and we did a lot of innovative things. And the next semester, the data told a much different story. The subgroup that was at the very bottom was now at the very top. All I'm saying is that as we begin to move forward, sometimes we have to just read the writing on the wall, and we have to stop ignoring the writing on the wall. Whatever the data is saying, whatever the narrative is saying, own it, deal with it, and build from it. And I think that if we would just be proactive along those lines and not ignore what we've known for the past, the presentation that she presented, what we've known for the past 300 years, if we'll just own it and confront it, we can't defeat what we're not willing to confront. And so I think that if we begin to confront all of these issues that we know that have been prevalent and that have been paralyzing and crippling our students for centuries, I think at least there we're at least on the right track.
And I would say, looking at equity without a film over our eyes. I'm trying to put it in the correct way. Looking at it for what it is. My colleague just said, use the data to tell the story and then act accordingly. Because what we really need, and this is what I would say to the board, is a level playing field. When you want equity, you have to remove every single barrier that stands in the way of a child achieving their highest potential. Taking down everything, and that will call for the board or for whoever it be to remove the sheet that is standing in the way and remove every single barrier that stands in the way of children achieving their full potential. I would also want to say that be passionate about looking at alternative sources for educators of color. So get a passion for finding alternative pathways to get educators of color in front of students in the classroom, especially in rural areas.
I would also like to add to that you know, in that same sentiment that Ms. Stewart was talking about taking the, you know, the film over our heads and our eyes, to make sure that, you know, like the playing field is completely level, and that everybody in the districts, you know, have the same set of rules and set of standards. That, you know, it's not putting you know, charter schools, public schools, private schools, you know, with different set of rules and guidelines. We all have the same type of ways of, you know, basically making sure that the schools represent the county that they work, and that, you know, that every person is represented within the schools, you know, and the numbers that they need to be. I guess that's my wish.
My wish goes back to the question about how important culture is in the schools, how important it is to have teachers, principals, you know, that look like the student body. And my wish is that, you know, where we have children of color, that we have representation there, principals, teachers, whether it be Hispanic students or Vietnamese students or Arabic or African American, you know, whichever population we have there. I would just love to have not only the person, but the teacher or principal being able to communicate with the children and families in their native language. That's my wish, that native language connection. We do a lot, I think, here in the county. I'm very proud of the work we're doing with our Hispanic families, communicating with them through family engagement nights, through Zoom. But it's opened my eyes that we need to give that same level to the Arabic families, to the Vietnamese families. So I'm now in the process of working on a plan how I can do that same type of work with our Arabic families. I think I've found a good parent liaison, someone who's a native speaker of Arabic but also speaks English. So I'm excited about continuing the work, and I appreciate this board listening to us and our ideas.
Yeah, I think that it's important to realize that when we talk about leveling the playing field, that some students are going to need more than others, right? And that's part of leveling the playing field. It's important to recognize that not every student starts at the same place, But in order for us to reach the same place in the end, we must all be given the necessary tools, and that can look different for different students. And that's why I believe strongly that education should be much more personalized with the student, and should also include like a very global and togetherness aspect that represents each and every student, and every identity and every journey that a student goes on. Right? If I could wave a magic wand and have something done by the end of this year, it would just be that the system is equitable, right? And I think we say that in a very light way, and it's going to take a lot of work, but that system is not that far from reaching that goal, right? It's just a matter of actually putting plans in place and actually accessing everything that you want to give the students, right? Yeah, I think if we can look at it from multiple perspectives, right? We can start with how much money the schools get, right? How much teachers are paid, how much we're learning in each grade, the different levels of students, and how we're organizing them within classes, and how that system is even broken up disproportionately and also a terrible way, right? So there's a lot that we can do to fix this system. And again, I just want to echo that we are so grateful to have this this opportunity to speak our minds and help influence the policies that you guys will be making very soon, hopefully. So thank you.
Say.
For me, so we learn history, right? But it's just American history. We speak on the general knowledge of like history. Like for me, I rather learn my own history, my personal history, my family history. So like if we could do things to change the curriculum, not just to learn the history of our country, but to learn the history of our people and the things that they did and the accomplishments they did. Like I understand we have Black History Month, but why do we have to have 1 month out of the year to celebrate? Why can't we celebrate every month?
Board members, you have an opportunity to ask any additional follow-up questions before we close out this phenomenal panel here before you today. I know what I've learned from students is to continue to give them voice and to remove those barriers. I've learned from our panelists that we must be innovative and continue to seek alternative sources of recruiting educators of color. I've learned that data tells the story and it should inform everything that we do. I thank you for offering your candid responses today, and I offer now an opportunity for board members to ask you any remaining questions before we close out today. But thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. Thank you. Board members.
Dr. Townsend Smith.
Yes, ma'am.
I'll just rather than put it in the chat, I'll just say it because I want to say it out loud. So those Math One innovations, I received a chat saying I'll be happy to share. Let's make that happen very soon, sometime right away, because math has been a concern of mine, perhaps the whole board, for a while. So this sounds like we're onto something. So maybe we can get that back as a board item in the near future. Thank you.
Yes,
thanks
ma'am.
to everyone. Great panel.
I would like to say something if I can. This is Donna Tiffany Rogers, and I want you to know this presentation has been so enlightening, and it's more than just a feel good of what we need to do moving forward, but it's a reminder that we all need to widen our lens. And the one thing in particular that Mr. Sellers said that stuck with me, and I even wrote it down: we don't want to shy our students away from their greatness. It's our responsibility as a board, as educators, to be sure we give every student their opportunity to find their greatness. So just want to say thank you again to everyone.
Ms. Townsend Smith.
Yes, sir.
This is Tony Jackson. I'd like to, first of all, say what a great panel, and I would be remiss if I didn't say I was partial to 3 of them that are up there, and to say to them publicly that I'm so very proud of them as I am the entire panel. I want to thank them for their authenticity, and I want to thank them for being extremely courageous to share, particularly our students for being willing to share. We have to provide that level of agency if we're ever going to get to the truth. I think we have to have authentic conversations if we're ever going to get to an authentic truth. And equity is about finding that authentic truth. And so I challenge all of us to be so very intentional about this work and to not shy away from the hard conversations. And I applaud you all for just being so courageous to at least share. For some, it may have been uncomfortable, but for all of us, it's definitely necessary. So I appreciate you, and to my colleagues from Vance County, proud of you guys. Thank you.
Dr. Townsend Smith.
Yes, sir.
So, following up on Tony Jackson's remarks, I think it's so powerful that you, as the director of the state board, and the board itself has such an interest in hearing voices from rural North Carolina and from eastern North Carolina. LaShawn, Elijah, Kenai, these guys are doing the work in Edgecombe County. We are a Tier 1 rural county on the Public School Forum's Roadmap of Need. We always fall between 90 and 100 in terms of the bottom 10 counties in the state. In those 4 main indicators, healthcare and economic development and crime and education. But for you to recognize that part of our equity journey is to lift up the voices of rural North Carolina, of eastern North Carolina, and to highlight the experiences of African American students and African American educators, to use that to inform our equity resolution, to use that to inform our framework for action. This is so powerful for us, okay? This matters to all of us east of 95, that you've brought this panel together and have elevated their voices at a state level. So for that, I want to thank you, and I want to thank the Strategic Planning Committee. I want to thank James and Jill for bringing Edgecombe to the table to talk. Even more so, though, if we are ever going to achieve the challenges laid out in the Leandro Commission report, and if we're ever going to approach the My Future NC attainment goals, 2 million highly credentialed workers by 2030, if we're going to achieve our 5-year strategic plan, we have to continue on an ongoing basis, making sure that what happens in Raleigh and that what happens at the 30,000 foot level translates down to the individual experience of students in classrooms and in schools. And so for that, I just want to challenge the board. I want to challenge us as advisors. I want to challenge everybody who's working at the agency, challenge our superintendent, challenge our legislators who are listening in on the call. I want to challenge us all to make sure that we are aligning our arrows as a state, because this isn't a matter of not knowing what to do. It's a matter of making sure that we muster the will and we coordinate together and we provide the resources to make sure that no child in North Carolina has to fight for equity. Kids shouldn't have to do that. So for that, I want to thank Elijah and Kenai for coming and speaking and elevating their voices to the conversation. And let's just all agree, all of us on this call, let's all agree that we are going to get this done, because we are living in a moment of history. We are living in a pivot point, and McCall said it, where history will judge us on what we do. Thank you.
Mr. Smith. Mr. Ford, I see the floor back to you.
Yeah, and I don't have much to say to that, Mr. Bristol Smith, other than bravo. And to the panels again, thank you. Getting ready to hand it back over to Mr. Chair and to Deanna. Just want to say again, eternally grateful for your assistance on this, and all of the leaders and students will continue to keep an open ear to your voices, and ask that you just continue to speak to us candidly. Mr. Chair, it's about 1:51, and so I'm going to hand it back over to you for our further instruction.
Thank you, Mr. Ford, Ms. Kamnitz, and for our guests who we learned so much from. We'll now take a break and return at 2:35. 2:35.